Hey, it's Bob Cobb again. So in this screencast, we want to talk a little bit about how you're positioning yourself in the mind of your clients, your prospects, any centers of influence you're working with. How are you describing the value that you bring to the table? And specifically, in fact, more importantly than that, do you have an ultimate value proposition? Now, this is diametrically opposed to a quote-unquote elevator speech or elevator presentation. And one of the things that I find interesting is that if I look at different people who are offering investment services, somebody from a wirehouse, somebody who is an RIA, somebody who is an independent financial advisor, somebody offering these services in a bank channel, somebody who is maybe an insurance agent who's moving into wealth management to diversify their business, or a CPA who is moving into wealth management to diversify their business. And I lined those 7 people up and said, all right, describe what you do. How would you, in a casual business setting, describe what you bring to the table? And the challenge is, if you go through that exercise, you're very likely to find that they all sound almost exactly the same. And another commonality of mediocrity that they're also going to share is they're all going to be describing what they do. So, for example, a common thing that you hear from time to time is I help affluent and ultra-affluent investors manage their risk through a sophisticated asset allocation strategy and a diversified portfolio, where I'm specifically building a portfolio that's in line with my clients' risk tolerances and time horizons, with the goal of outperforming the market on the upside and protecting them on the downside, or some version of that. And everybody sounds exactly the same. So here's an exercise for you. Write down, take a second, pause this screencast, and take 30 seconds to write down how you would describe what you do in a networking type setting. If somebody comes up and introduces themselves and say, hey Joe, how are you? What do you do? What are you going to say to them? And if it's an exact copy, more or less, of what I just said, then don't bother going through the exercise. But if you've got something significantly different, then go through and see if it's going to pass the test that I'm going to give you here in just a second. Okay, so hopefully you went through the exercise. If not, here's the test anyway. You can always do it later. Number 1 test that you must pass in order to have an ultimate, your ultimate value proposition, is number 1, it's got to separate you from the competition. You have to, from the word go, as soon as you begin, get clients to conclude, that's different. So, for example, if you worked with a lot of business owners and you had a business that not only worked with their retirement plans, but also their own personal wealth, maybe you had somebody who would help them with an exit strategy that was on your team, or a business broker that you've got an affiliation with, you might say, when asked, what do you do? I help business owners avoid the 5 biggest landmines that stand between them and the retirement of their dreams. Now, that is probably, for most business owners, a pretty unique statement of what it is that you do. And it's also probably going to pass our 4th test, which we'll talk about in just a second. Second is it's got to focus on your clients' problems, not your solutions. if you were to go to a doctor and suddenly find, or if somebody very close to you was to go to a doctor and find out that they've got cancer of one type or another, the doctor may have a number of different solutions that he could talk about. He could talk about chemotherapy. He could talk about radiation. He could talk about surgery. He could talk about some combination of all of the above. And if he was to go into detail about those, most people aren't going to care. What they want to know is this is the best path to solve the problem. In fact, in those circumstances, the two questions that people tend to ask first is, number one, why me? What did I do that caused this to happen? And the second is, what does this mean and what do I do next? So actually those three questions that people are probably going to ask, and a smart doctor is going to focus on those areas and then come back and describe his process that he's recommending at some point later. So that's our second test. Third thing is, it's got to be repeatable, particularly if you're going to take advantage of one of the biggest benefits of a market like this, and that is people are out there looking for answers. Your clients, who are your raving fans, have got people in their circle of influence who are looking for answers, and they can position you powerfully and positively in the client's mind. But in order to be able to do that, they need to be able to elegantly describe what it is that you do. Therefore, your value proposition does not want to be littered with a bunch of industry buzzwords. Rather, it wants to be something that even 88-year-old Aunt Mildred can repeat to somebody inside her circle of influence. Finally, and most importantly, does it cause the client to engage? Is what you're saying joining the conversation in their head and getting them to do one of two things? Number one is, if you're using something like a version of the landmines, the 5 major landmines, a business owner might say, boy, do I need to talk to you. I am glad we ran into each other because I got some problems. Or they might say, landmines, what landmines? In which case you want to be prepared to go into a little bit of a longer version of what it is that you do, and that needs to have 4 parts. Number one, you want to join the conversation that's going on in their head. And you want to do that by talking to them about the problems that they're likely to be facing. Number two, you want to agitate those problems a little bit. In other words, talk to them about what's going to happen if they don't solve those problems right away. Number three, introduce your solutions, but do it very, very briefly. And number four, have a call to action. Talk about what is going to be the next step that you're going to follow on that path. So I've got some resources at the website that if you want to dive a little bit more into building your ultimate value proposition, 2 ways that you're going to do that. First, you're going to get very, very clear on who is your ideal client. And a lot of financial advisors that I talk to, they say, well, I want to work with anybody with money, or anybody that can pay my fee, or anybody that will follow my advice. And my response is, no, you don't. You want to get very clear on who it is that you work with, who you like to work with, and then begin to market directly to those people. Now, an ideal client doesn't have to mean you're only going to work with business advisors, although at some point maybe that will be all that you work with, or at least maybe it may be the 80-20 rule, the vast majority of the clients that you work with. But you can have as many different ideal client profiles as you want, but for each and every one of them, you'll have a unique ultimate value proposition, or UVP, that you'll be able to share with that particular client group.